Okay, Human Geography, Levy here again, and welcome to part 2 of 8.3, Supranationalism versus Devolution. So we just finished up going over cultural supranationalism, which is similar cultures promote shared goals and resolve disputes. Examples again, we have the African Union and the Arab League. This is where we have alliances where two or more countries trying to promote cultural goals. And so you have the African Union, these are countries in Africa, trying to promote the same goals and sometimes even promote like tourism and such. Arab League, these are the Muslim countries in North Africa, or what we call the Maghreb, and Southwest Asia through the Arabian Peninsula, also trying to promote promote cultural identity and work towards resolving regional conflicts and promote economic growth. So again, what's the effect? Working towards resolving regional conflicts and promote economic growth. Next, we have how has supranationalism affected the international boundaries in Europe? Again, with the European Union, it has created the free flow of goods and labor. So materials and finished products can go between the member countries without having to stop for checkpoints and different political requirements. Same with labor. Labor can move between their member countries back and forth. So those international boundaries between country to country, so from France to Germany and Germany to Czech Republic, these boundaries have a little bit less severity and meaning because people of the European Union can move back and forth. Next, let's talk about this concept of devolution. Devolution also affects the political structure of a country and the government of the country because it can change the representation within the system. Because what devolution is, it's the process but through which regions or groups within a country, so this is a region or a group within a country, begins to resist against the government and demand more autonomy and more representation within the government at the expense of that central government. So for example, let's say in the United States, you would have groups within the United States, let's say it's the Native American groups, and they become angry or disenchanted, disenfranchised from the government. They began to demand more representation and more autonomy, more sort of self-rule and independence at the expense of the federal government. This is what's happening with Scotland and the UK. Scotland is a little bit they're unhappy with the government within the UK, so they're demanding more independence, more autonomy, more representation in the government of the UK. That demand for that representation and more autonomy is called devolution. De-evolution means evolution means the progress of the state. Devolution means that the state is going backwards in development, meaning that the regions in the country, like the Basque people in Spain, they are beginning to demand more autonomy, more representation because they're unhappy with the government in the country and the representation in that government, and instead they'd like to have more independence and self-rule. This is the same with the Chechens in Russia. They're unhappy with the Russian government, so they are demanding more autonomy. They're demanding more self-rule. And again, that's at the expense of that central government, and that process of that demand is called devolution. It can result in two things. One, breakup of a country, which is called balkanization, or two, more powers given to internal units, so you have a more shift from a unitary to a federal government system. Let's talk about the breakup of a state and when this has occurred, like when devolution and these devolutionary forces and these groups demanding more independence and more autonomy has led to the country actually falling apart. This would be Yugoslavia and the Balkans that broke up because just so many groups, from the Serbs to the Croatians, they just did not get along and they wanted more independence, and the state broke up. Former USSR, Afghanistan was the first to break away from the Soviet Union, and then other Central Asian countries broke away from them as well. And again, started with the demand for more autonomy and resulted in just the country busting up. Czechoslovakia broke up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Ethiopia with Eritrea, Austria and Hungary into Austria and Hungary, British India broke up into India and Pakistan, and Sudan into Sudan and South Sudan. Again, when the groups within the country, they just do not get along, and you have some groups that are just demanding more autonomy, more independence, and that ultimately results in them breaking up. It can also just result in the demand for more autonomy, where you have a more shift from a unitary to federal system, and that demand for more autonomy is actually given. So they get more self-rule, and they get more independence, and they get more representation in the government. This has happened in the UK with the Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England, specifically with Scotland demanding more independence and self-rule, and the government in the UK gave it to them. Same Belgium with the Flemings and the Walloons. Canada with the French Quebecians and the native people. The government in Canada has granted them that more self-autonomy or self-rule. This is a way of keeping the country together. In Spain, the Basque people. In India, the regions where the different languages and ethnicities, they've allowed them to kind of act independently. Russia and Chechnya, Pakistan with their different clans, tribes, and ethnicities. Again, where this demand for more autonomy has actually worked. But the country stays together, but the federal government, the central government, loses a little bit of control, and the internal units gain more. The impact of devolution, it can create new countries, like in Yugoslavia. It can create new governments, like from a unitary to federal government, like in Poland and India. You give more power to the regions, like in Belgium. You see regional separatism, like the Basques in Spain, the Chechens in Russia, federal states with their own languages in India. You see more political instability, like civil war, hostility, conflict, ethnic cleansing, like in Yugoslavia and Eastern Europe. You see economic instability because war hits your economy and damages your own land, and you're killing your own people, so this will hurt you economically. Or if you favor one group over the other, like in Spain or Belgium or in Rwanda with the Hutus and the Tutsis. You see mass migration, like in India, where the Hindus fled over the border into India, and in Pakistan, the Muslims fled over the border into Pakistan. People in the Balkans trying to escape the war and poverty. So let's talk about how ethno-nationalism, that you have more loyalty and identification with your ethnicity, your ethnic group above any other concept, certainly above the country itself, and loyalty to the country. You have more loyalty to your ethnic group than loyalty to your country. And so this can create new international boundaries, like in Sudan and South Sudan. These countries split into two countries because there was just more identification with the ethnic group than with the country of origin. Former Yugoslavia, you saw this break up with Bosnia and Croatia. Pakistan and India, these groups again separate because there's more identification with the ethnicity than with the country as a whole. You saw this in Czechoslovakia with Czech Republic and Slovakia. You saw this you see this in Rwanda, which ultimately results in also with the creation of the Congo. Next, let's describe how the cultural diversity contributes to devolutionary pressures within a country. So when you have differences in language, religion, history, or ethnicity, this tends to isolate people, and then people feel less invested and less represented in the countries. And because they feel less represented and more isolated, they will then begin to demand more representation and autonomy for their groups. So again, that cultural diversity can lead to, like in Spain with the Basque people, they're demanding more autonomy, more representation, because you see this difference in language and religion and their history and their ethnicity. Same with the French Quebecians in Canada. Same with the groups in Yugoslavia, where again, every country has some devolutionary pressure and cultural diversity because of the isolation and the differences. They can really begin to demand more autonomy. Next, how physical geography and territorial size contribute to devolutionary pressures within a country. Because the physical features or barriers, such as mountains or bodies or water, can isolate people again, and they can feel alienated and less involved and less represented. distance between the capital or the core areas and the periphery, barriers to infrastructure, communication or connectivity, lack of roads and railroads, regional differences in the location or availability of natural resources. In large countries where you have smaller areas may want autonomy or separation. Comparatively smaller territories or regions within a country. Again, this is all about isolation and separation and differences that will, isolation especially, creates that more separate interest, and therefore they'll begin to feel that they're underrepresented and they'll demand more autonomy, more representation. Next, how regional economic differences. This is where you have some regions in a country that are really wealthy and some regions that are not, and how this can contribute to devolutionary pressure. This can lead to inequality between the two regions, uneven economic development. You can see differences in the allocation of resources and different services. You see differences in predominant economic activities, and then groups become angry because they see that other groups are getting more than them, and then they begin again to act out against the government and demand more autonomy and self-representation and self-rule and equality. So again, devolution is about demanding, feeling isolated, feeling alienated, feeling separated, and demanding more representation, more equality, more autonomy, more self-rule. Next, let's talk about how relocating the capital has contributed to the national identity and strengthened the state. So when you relocate your capital, this is called a forward capital. And oh, I'm sorry, this is that information is actually not correct there. Let me just, okay, so this should say, this one, just let me pause here. Okay, sorry about that. So this is how economic development has contributed to a stronger national identity and a strengthened the country. This would be in China, Japan, Mexico, South Africa, South Korea, and United States. The strong economy creates the jobs, creates this sense of well-being in their country, and supports confidence in leadership and loyalty to the country, all leading to greater unity. Economic prosperity tends to mask ethnic differences and divisions because people have greater economic access. And national pride reinforces that national identity. So economic development is very good for national identity and the strengthening of the state when you have that economic capability. Next would be the relocation of a country's capital. This is again called a forward capital. Brazil did this, Nigeria did this, and Pakistan did this. The centralized capital that breaks the ties with the colonial past. This is like countries who had colonial past and their capitals were established by the colonial power like the British, and they want to leave that behind, so they create a new capital. This is intended to overcome regional imbalance and strengthen the state, or it may strengthen historic focus on the interior. Like in Brazil, they wanted more people to move from the overcrowded cities on the coast and into the interior, so that they could focus on more poorly developed interior and the resource frontier. And this was also a return to historically symbolic location. So relocating the country's capital, this is called a forward capital. This can also be very good for the national identity and strengthening that country. Let's talk about what can weaken a country and detract from the national identity. One would be multi-ethnicities that don't get along or who demand more autonomy. This would be in Belgium, Canada, Russia, USSR, and Yugoslavia. This is when you have ethnic tension erodes the loyalty to the state. The tension between the ethnic groups can lead to balkanization, separatism, devolution, regionalism, sectionalism, and ethno-nationalism. This placement of political boundaries without regard to traditional ethnic territories can lead to fracture between the ethnic groups who lose or gain territory, and this ethnic strife defeats any attempts at nationalism. And this immigration causes cultural change. So again, ethnicities can take away from national identity and weaken the state. And the last one is transportation infrastructure, like in Chile, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, India, and Russia. This is when you have poor transportation infrastructure like roads and railroads that contribute to isolation and a sense of separatism and separation. This friction of distance, meaning the greater the distance, the less likely that places are to interact with one another, so that creates isolation. The size and shape of the state may hinder the development, and the colonial legacy also affects this transportation network, so it can take away from the state.